Welcome to HOA Violation Vault. Keep your boots on for this one. I need you to step back from my mailbox right now. That is what I said to Judith Turner at 7:45 in the morning on a Tuesday in February, standing at the USPS mailbox cluster curb in my Woodland Drift neighborhood in Salt Lake City, Utah, with a deputy sheriff telling her the exact same thing. She was blocking my mail slot with her clipboard, screaming about violations and fees, and I had my phone out recording every word, because this woman had been trying to destroy my life for 3 weeks straight. My name is on a mortgage. I teach history at a community college, and I cannot afford complaints or liens or any of the chaos she had been manufacturing since the day the HOA Plow tore up my driveway edge and she decided to blame me for it and fine me for the repair. I moved to Salt Lake City 2 years ago for the job and the cost of living, and I bought a townhouse in Woodland Drift because the neighborhood looked quiet and the HOA fees were reasonable. The Woodland Drift HOA Incorporated turned out to be the kind of place where deadlines change depending on who is being targeted, and Judith Turner, the self-appointed compliance officer, was the enforcement arm. She had red hair and tight curls, a pink parka she wore like a uniform, gray earmuffs, and a smart watch she tapped whenever she wanted you to know she was in charge. Her favorite line was, "If you make me repeat myself, it gets more expensive." She said it to me twice in the first conversation, and I knew right then I was in trouble. The trouble started 3 weeks earlier, the morning after a heavy February snowstorm. I woke up to find a chunk of my driveway edge ripped out, asphalt and gravel scattered across the snow, and a notice taped to my door. The notice said I was responsible for the damage, and I had 72 hours to arrange repairs, or the HOA would fine me $300 and assess additional daily penalties. I stood there in my white puffer jacket and black knit beanie, staring at the destruction, and I knew immediately what had happened. The HOA Plow had clipped the edge during the overnight clearing run, pushed too hard into the turn, and torn up the curb. I had seen the plow driver that morning, a guy in a Woodland Drift contractor vest, and he had not even slowed down. I called the management company that afternoon and explained what happened. The woman on the phone told me all plow damage claims had to go through the compliance officer, Judith Turner, and she would review the incident. I asked for photos from the plow company, timestamps, anything that would prove it was not my fault. She said Judith would handle it. 2 days later, Judith showed up at my door with a laminated policy sheet in one hand and her smart watch in the other. She told me the plow had been operating within normal parameters, and the damage was consistent with a homeowner who had placed snow removal equipment too close to the edge. I said I did not own snow removal equipment. She tapped her watch and said, "If you make me repeat myself, it gets more expensive." I asked to see the plow logs. She said the logs were proprietary and not available to homeowners. I asked to speak to the board. She said the board had delegated enforcement to her office, and I could file a formal appeal for a $200 processing fee. I told her I was not paying for damage the HOA caused. She smiled and said, "You will pay the fee. Then you will pay the fee about the fee." Then she handed me a second notice with a late penalty already added and walked away. That was the moment I realized this was not about the driveway. This was about control, and I was the target. I am trying to sell the house because the college offered me a better position in another state, and the listing was supposed to go live in 2 weeks. Judith knew that. She had asked about the for sale sign during a neighborhood meeting in January, and I had mentioned the timeline. Now she was threatening disclosures and liens, and every day I waited made the sale harder. I started gathering evidence that night. I went back through my phone photos and found a shot I had taken the morning before the storm, showing the driveway edge intact. I pulled up the county property records and confirmed the HOA was responsible for common area maintenance, which included snow removal on shared access roads and driveways. I printed the CC&Rs, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions document that governed the HOA, and I found the section on maintenance liability. It was clear. The HOA was responsible for damage caused by contracted services, and homeowners could dispute fines with written evidence submitted within 10 business days. I submitted my dispute the next morning, attaching the before photo, the property records, and the CC&R's citation. I walked it to the management company office myself and got a stamped receipt. The clerk told me I would hear back within 5 business days. 3 days later, Judith showed up again, this time with a new notice. She said my appeal had been reviewed and denied because I had failed to include a third-party damage assessment from a licensed contractor. I said the CC&Rs did not require that. She tapped her watch and said, "The rules changed last month. You should have read the email." I checked my email. There was no update. I called the management company and asked for the new policy. They said they would look into it. Judith called me that evening and left a voicemail. She said if I did not pay the original fine plus the late penalties by the end of the week, she would forward my account to collections and file a lien packet with the county. She also said my guests would be cited or towed during the next snow emergency, which was forecast for that weekend, because my driveway was now considered a safety hazard. I stood in my kitchen listening to the message, and I felt my chest tighten. I had to pick up my sister from the airport on Saturday before the roads iced over, and Judith was threatening to tow her rental car if she parked in my driveway. That Friday, I got a call from a former management company employee named Eric. He had worked for Woodland Drift HOA for 2 years before quitting, and he had heard through a neighbor that Judith was going after me. He said he recognized the scheme because he had seen her do it to 3 other homeowners. She would assign fines for HOA-caused damage, deny appeals with fake rule changes, and then push the homeowner into collections to create a lien that would block refinancing or sales. The management company knew, but they did not care because they got paid either way. Eric said he had kept copies of some of the emails and notices from his time there, and he was willing to testify if I needed a witness. I asked him if he had anything that proved the rules had not changed. He said he had the January board meeting minutes, and there was no mention of any policy update. I gave him a small thank you, because he just handed me leverage. I did not tell him what I had found at the city clerk's office earlier that week. I had gone downtown on my lunch break and pulled the municipal snow removal ordinances, and I discovered the HOA had misrepresented a city rule in one of their enforcement letters. Judith had claimed the city required homeowners to clear driveway edges within 12 hours of a snowfall, but the actual ordinance only applied to sidewalks adjacent to public streets, and it gave property owners 24 hours. The HOA had no authority to shorten that window or extend it to private driveways. The clerk had stamped a confirmation for me, and I had the document in my car. I did not deploy it yet. I was waiting for the right moment, and I knew it was coming. Judith was escalating too fast, and she was going to make a mistake. Saturday morning, the snow emergency hit. My sister flew in at 10, and I picked her up at the airport without incident. By the time we got back to the house, there were 4 inches of new snow on the driveway, and a tow truck with a distinctive amber strobe parked at the curb. Judith was standing next to it, talking to the driver and pointing at my sister's rental car. I pulled into the driveway and got out. Judith turned and said the rental was in violation of guest parking limits during a snow emergency, and it needed to be moved immediately, or it would be towed. I said the car was in my driveway, not a guest spot. She said the driveway was a hazard zone and all vehicles had to be relocated to the visitor lot until repairs were completed. The tow driver looked uncomfortable. I walked over and asked him who hired him. He said Woodland Drift HOA, compliance officer. I asked him if he had a written authorization. He said he had a voicemail. I told him the HOA did not have the authority to tow vehicles from private driveways without a court order, and if he hooked the car, I would file a theft report with the sheriff. He looked at Judith. She tapped her watch and said, "You are interfering with enforcement." I said, "You are trespassing, and I have it on video." I held up my phone with the recording light visible, screen turned away so she could not see what I was actually recording. The driver unhooked his equipment and left. Judith stood there for a long moment, staring at me, and then she said, "You will regret this." She walked back to her car, and I watched her pull out her phone and start making calls. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was calling different tow drivers like she was speed dialing chaos, trying to find someone who would hook the car without asking questions. I called Eric and told him what happened. He said Judith had a rotation of 3 tow companies she used, and one of them would show up within the hour. He gave me the name of the owner of the company she used most often, a guy named Ron, who ran a lot on the west side. Eric said Ron was reasonable, and he might listen if I had proof the HOA was overstepping. I thanked him and drove straight to the tow lot. I found Ron in the office, and I showed him the city clerk confirmation that proved the HOA had misrepresented the ordinance in writing. I told him Judith was using his company to enforce fake rules, and if he kept working with her, he was going to end up named in a lawsuit. Ron read the document, looked at me and said, "She told me this was all legal." I said she lied, and you just became her liability. He picked up his phone and called Judith. I heard him tell her he was cutting ties immediately and she needed to find another contractor. Then he hung up and told me to get out of his office. I drove back to the house feeling like I had just bought myself a day, maybe 2. But I knew Judith was not done. She had 2 more tow companies on her list, and she was going to keep pushing until something stuck. That afternoon, I got an email from the management company. It said my account had been forwarded to their legal department for non-payment, and they were preparing a lien packet with a bogus ledger and mystery line items. The ledger listed the original driveway fine, the late penalties, an appeal processing fee I had never agreed to, a snow emergency enforcement fee for the tow truck call, and something called an administrative review surcharge. The total was over $1,500. I printed the email and the ledger, and I highlighted every line item that did not match the original notice. Then I called an attorney. The attorney told me the HOA could not file a lien without a formal hearing, and I had the right to dispute the charges in front of the board. She said the mystery fees were likely unenforceable, but I needed to show up at the next meeting with documentation and witnesses. She also said if the HOA filed the lien without a hearing, I could sue for wrongful lien and probably win damages. I asked her how long that would take. She said 6 months, maybe a year. I told her I was trying to sell the house in 2 weeks. She said, "Then you need to shut this down at the meeting." The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday night, 5 days away. I spent the weekend preparing. I pulled every email, every notice, every voicemail Judith had sent me. I organized them into a timeline with timestamps, and I cross-referenced each one against the CC&Rs to show where she had invented rules or ignored procedures. I also pulled the security camera footage from my doorbell, which showed the HOA plow clipping the driveway edge at 4:30 in the morning the day after the storm. The footage was grainy, but you could see the plow blade catch the asphalt and pull it up in one clean rip. I saved the clip to a thumb drive. Eric called me Monday morning and said Judith had been spotted at the gas station Sunday night, following another homeowner and filming them with her phone. He said the homeowner had posted about it in the neighborhood group chat, and people were starting to ask questions. I told him to keep me updated. That afternoon, I had to make a heat supply run to the hardware store for a space heater because my furnace was acting up, and Judith followed me there in her car. I saw her pull in behind me in the parking lot, and when I got out, she was filming me from her driver's seat. I walked over and knocked on her window. She rolled it down and said, "This is public property, I can film whoever I want." I said, "You are stalking me, and I am documenting it." I held up my phone and took a photo of her car, her license plate, and her face. Then I checked the timestamp on my phone and said out loud, February 14th, 3:15 in the afternoon, Judith Turner following me to the hardware store. She rolled up her window and drove away. But I was not done. I drove to the gas station she had been at the night before, the one where she had followed the other homeowner, and I pulled the timestamp from my neighbor's group chat post. Then I cross-referenced it with Judith's own social media, where she had posted a photo of herself at a restaurant across town at the exact same time. She had lied about being at the gas station, or she had faked the timestamp on her harassment video, and either way I had just trapped her in her own timeline. I saved the screenshots and added them to my evidence folder. Tuesday morning, a contractor showed up at my house with a wheel clamp, the kind you use to boot a car. He said he had been hired by the HOA to secure my vehicle for unpaid fines. I asked him for a work order. He showed me a printed email with no letterhead and no signature. I told him the HOA could not boot private vehicles on private property without a court judgment, and if he touched my car, I would call the police. He said he was just doing his job. I said, "Your job is illegal, and I am going to show you why." I pulled out the CC&Rs and flipped to the section on enforcement remedies. It listed fines, lien filings, and access restrictions, but it explicitly banned physical restraints on vehicles. I read it out loud, and the contractor looked at the email again, then at me, and then he packed up his equipment and left. Judith called me 10 minutes later. She said I was interfering with enforcement actions and I would face additional penalties. I said, "You just tried to boot my car with a fake work order, and I have the contractor's name." She said, "If you make me repeat myself, it gets more expensive." I said, "You already repeated yourself, and it is all on tape." Then I hung up. Wednesday afternoon, Eric called me with news. He said a current employee at the management company had reached out to him anonymously and admitted the company had been backdating notices to trigger late fees faster. The employee said Judith had been pressuring them to manipulate the mailing dates so homeowners would miss deadlines before they even received the first notice, and the company had gone along with it because it increased revenue. The employee was willing to testify, but only if they could stay anonymous until after the meeting. I told Eric to keep them safe and I would handle the rest. That was the twist I needed. The management company had been complicit the entire time, and now I had proof. I updated my timeline with the new information, and I prepared a second document that showed the pattern: backdated notices, fake rule changes, escalating fees, and harassment. I printed everything in triplicate: one set for me, one set for the board, and one set for the attorney if I needed to file suit. Thursday night, I walked into the Woodland Drift HOA board meeting with a folder full of evidence, a thumb drive, and Eric sitting next to me as my witness. The meeting was in the community center, a small room with folding tables and fluorescent lights. Judith was already there, sitting at the front table with 3 board members. She saw me and smiled. I sat down and waited. The board president opened the meeting and called my name. He said I was on the agenda to dispute a lien filing, and I had 10 minutes to present my case. I stood up, walked to the front, and plugged the thumb drive into the projector. The first thing I showed was the doorbell footage of the plow ripping up the driveway edge. The board members leaned forward. Judith said, "That footage is inconclusive." I said, "It shows your contractor destroying my property at 4:30 in the morning, and you fined me for it." Then I pulled up the timeline of notices, and I highlighted the backdated mailing dates. I said, "Your management company admitted they manipulated the dates to trigger penalties before I could respond, and I have a witness who will testify under oath." Judith stood up and said, "This is harassment, and you are wasting the board's time." I said, "You followed me to a hardware store, you tried to boot my car, you called 4 different tow companies, and you filed a lien with fake fees." Then I played the voicemail where she said, "You will pay the fee, then you will pay the fee about the fee." The room went silent. One of the board members said, "Judith, is that your voice?" She did not answer. I said, "She also misrepresented a city ordinance to justify enforcement, and I have confirmation from the city clerk." I pulled out the stamped document and held it up. Then I said, "And one more thing." I connected my phone to the projector and pulled up the screenshot of Judith's social media post, the one that proved she had lied about the gas station timeline. I said, she claimed she was following a homeowner Sunday night at 8:15, but she posted a photo of herself at a restaurant across town at 8:12. She either faked the harassment video or she is in two places at once. The board president looked at Judith and said, "Do you have an explanation?" Judith said, "I do not have to explain anything to him." The president said, "You are explaining it to us." She tried to storm out, and one of the board members said, "Judith, we need your motion on record." She turned around and said, "What?" He said, "If you are disputing these claims, we need a formal motion so we can vote." She stared at him, and then she said, "I am not disputing anything, I am leaving." And she walked out. The board went into a closed session for 20 minutes. When they came back, the president said the board had voted to remove the enforcement action and void the ledger entry. He also said Judith Turner was being removed from her compliance officer role pending an internal review, and the management company was being instructed to issue a formal apology and a fine waiver in writing with a firm no-contact directive. He handed me a folder with the signed resolution, and he said, "We are sorry this happened, and we will make sure it does not happen again." If you are enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA nightmare stories. I walked out of the meeting with Eric, and we stood in the parking lot for a minute in the cold. Eric said, "You just took down the entire system." I said, "I took down one compliance officer and one bad policy. The system is still broken." But I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The lien was gone, the fees were gone, and Judith could not touch me anymore. The fallout came fast. Within 2 days, 3 other homeowners filed formal complaints against Judith, using my timeline as a template. The management company tried to bury it, but the board forced an audit, and the auditors found over 20 backdated notices spanning 6 months. The management company issued a public apology and offered refunds to every affected homeowner. Judith was forced to retract her claim in writing, and the board posted the retraction in the neighborhood group chat. She moved out of Woodland Drift a month later. But the biggest consequence came from the city. Once the audit went public, a reporter picked it up, and the city planning office launched an investigation into Woodland Drift HOA's snow removal practices. They found the HOA had been violating municipal snow route regulations by blocking shared access roads with piled snow and debris, and they had been using enforcement actions to cover up the violations. The city issued a formal warning to the HOA to stop interfering with snow routes, and the board publicly reversed Karen's policy to avoid municipal fines. The new policy required the HOA to photograph all plow routes before and after clearing, submit the photos to the city, and establish a homeowner dispute process with third-party arbitration. I closed on the house sale 3 weeks later. The title company had flagged the lien initially, but once the board resolution came through, it cleared without delay. My realtor said the buyer almost walked because of the HOA drama, but the board's public reversal convinced them the association was cleaning up. I signed the papers, handed over the keys, and drove out of Woodland Drift for the last time. The last I heard, Judith tried to get a compliance officer position in another HOA across town, but word had spread. The neighborhood group chats in Salt Lake City are connected, and people talk. She did not get the job. Eric told me she ended up leaving the state entirely, and the Woodland Drift Board hired a professional management company with actual licensing and oversight. I still have the folder with all the evidence. I keep it in my car, just in case I ever run into another Judith Turner. Because the thing about HOAs is, the rules are only as good as the people enforcing them, and if those people are willing to lie, manipulate, and harass, you have to be ready to fight back with documentation, witnesses, and proof. The morning I left, I drove past the USPS mailbox cluster one last time, the spot where Judith had blocked my mail, and the deputy had to tell her to step back. There was a knit hat dropped in slush near the curb, gray with a pom-pom, probably left by a kid. I did not stop. I just kept driving, and I thought about how close I came to losing the house, the sale, and maybe even my job if Judith had managed to drag me into court or get a formal complaint filed with the college. But I had the receipts, and I had Eric, and I had the city clerk confirmation that she just handed me leverage. And in the end, that was enough. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.